All right, so now we're going to take a closer look at that first kind of category of desired aggregate expenditure, desired consumption expenditure. So desired consumption expenditure. We've kind of denoted just C in our model. So right now we had, in this simplified model after our assumptions, we just have AE, or desired aggregate expenditure, equals consumption and investment, desired consumption and desired investment. I'm just concentrating on this first term on the right-hand side, consumption, desired consumption. So the first thing we should talk about is disposable income. And what disposable income is it's the income you have after taxes. Well, that's what's going to be in our model. Income after taxes. So if we wanted to kind of define it mathematically, we might denote it YD, where this superscript or subscript, whatever you want for this D, is going to be indicating desired, is what that means. So it equals your national income minus your taxes. So this is disposable income. This is just national income. And this capital T is going to be our taxes. So right now, notice that there's no government. Remember, one of our assumptions is that there's no government in this economy. So with no government, there's no taxes. No taxes, which means T equals 0. And so what this means is, in this simple model, so just for now, we're going to add the government back next week. We're going to have disposable income as just national income. And I'm going to try to underline that's just for this week. And it's just because of this assumption we made about there being no government. Okay, so disposable income is basically after-tax income. With no government, there's no taxes, which means disposable income is just your income. It's just your national income. And we can think of two different things that we can do with our disposable income. We could spend it on consumption, or we could save it. Two options for YD. We can either consume or save. And so anything that's not consumed is saved, and everything that's not saved, we're going to assume it's consumed. Okay, so now we're going to kind of talk about the consumption function. And so essentially what we're doing here is we're trying to think about how are we going to model desired consumption expenditure. So again, we had AE, I keep repeating this, but A equals C plus I. We're concentrating on this C. We've kind of introduced this idea of what disposable income is. And now we're trying to come up with a functional form that describes, well, what's determining that desired level of expenditure? So we're thinking about the factors that are affecting this consumption, how we're going to kind of mathematically connect the factors to produce this, this desired level of consumption expenditure. And so what the consumption function does, is it's going to relate the factors that affect desired consumption into the actual amount that, the desired consumption we see. So it's the relationship between desired consumption expenditures, or cons for consumption, EXP for expenditure, to the factors that are affecting it. And in particular, I mean, we're really going to concentrate on current disposable income and that relationship. But there's going to be other factors that we can think about that are going to kind of change our desired consumption levels. We're going to keep things simple and think about it's just current disposable income that's really going to affect it directly. But in more complicated economic theories, we have these kind of people are forward-looking. The world is dynamic. People look ahead and think about what's going to happen in the future when they make decisions today. We're kind of going to avoid that complication for now and just kind of consider like a more static model where we're not forward-looking. We're just looking at our disposable income right now. And so the factors that we think might affect, or the factors we're going to talk about anyway, that are going to affect consumption, desired level of consumption, are going to be disposable income, so we've kind of introduced what disposable income is just a couple of minutes ago. But this is going to be like one of the main parts of our consumption function. The other things we might think are going to affect our consumption is wealth. That's different than income. It's like accrued, wealth. We're probably going to think the higher your wealth, the higher your consumption, and vice versa. Another thing that might influence consumption is going to be interest rates. It's going to change borrowing, right, or lending. It's changing like the price you get, the price it costs for buying, the price of credit essentially is what it is. And so if you can collect more interest through your savings, that might affect how much you're dividing your disposable income between savings and consumption might change due to these interest rates. And 4, expectations about the future. So this is kind of how that dynamic expectations about the future. And, as I said, we're kind of concentrating on current disposable income as kind of influencing consumption and not thinking about or trying to model that people are actually forward-looking. And so how we're going to get this kind of dynamic aspect to our model in the simplest way possible, we can kind of add these expectations about the future. And that's going to affect what you do today. If you think the economy is going to do worse in the future, that might affect how much you consume today. You might save more today because you think the economy and your income is going to go down in the future, and vice versa. All right, so we're going to go through, we're going to come up with an idea of what a consumption function might look like. We'll talk about how these other factors, or these 4 factors, are going to influence desired consumption in the simplest model that we can come up with of the macroeconomy. So let's imagine our simplest consumption function. So C, so the desired level of consumption, is going to be equal to A plus B times YD. So C is going to be desired consumption, and YD is our disposable income, as we've talked about. Disposable? No, let's say it's disposable. Disposable income. So remember, after-tax income. But this was effectively Y without government, right? Because there's no taxes. Okay, so this consumption function is relating different factors. In this case, we're really concentrating on disposable income and how it affects C. And so what A is its autonomous, desired expenditure. So it doesn't depend on Y, right? It's consumption that we do no matter what. And then what BYD is, we'll talk a bit more about what B actually represents in a couple seconds here, is its induced desired. I should be careful, maybe I should specify that it's consumption expenditure I'm talking about here, which is part of desired aggregate expenditure, but I just want to make sure. Induced desired consumption expenditure. So it's expenditure on consumption that depends on your level of income. So your level of national income is going to affect your disposable income, since disposable income is, remember, it's y minus t, where t equals 0 here. And so B times YD is going to be induced. It's going to change depending on the level of national income. So it depends on Y. And if we want to think about, maybe I'll quickly erase this before we draw, and we can kind of think about, maybe get in a bit more details about what this B kind of stands for and what we're going to call it. Okay, so we've kind of introduced this idea of this consumption function. We have desired level of consumption equals autonomous consumption, denoted by A, and we have this second term, B times disposable income, where this whole term is induced consumption expenditure, or consumption expenditure that depends on the level of national income. And so let's quickly kind of draw it out and think about what this means, and let's put consumption, or desired consumption. It's supposed to say desired, and then we have income down here. We can think of it just being disposable income maybe right now. And essentially what we're doing with desired consumption is we have an intercept. Here's YD, so this is that x value, so y equals mx plus b is kind of the equivalence equation of a line. And so we have this intercept of A, and we have a slope of B. And this is what our consumption function looks like. Now we can think of, maybe a 45-degree line as, I'll use a different color, means that, our consumption or desired consumption equals our disposable income. If they're both equal, that means it's a 45-degree line, right? Because on every point along that line, these two things are equal. So if we drew a 45-degree line, and it's not going to be a perfect 45-degree line, my writing, or my skills in terms of diagrams. So this is 45 degrees. And so at all these points, YD equals consumption. So the difference between this consumption function and this 45-degree line kind of tells you something about the savings, right? The idea here is like, even if our income is 0, we still have some level of consumption. We're going to have negative savings. We're going to borrow money in order to spend some money on like food and shelter and things like that. And so we're going to have negative savings until these points cross. At any point to the right, we're consuming less than our disposable income. So there's maybe positive savings over here and a negative to the left. Positive savings over here, and then we have like negative savings. We're borrowing money over here. So this is what the consumption function might look like. A is the intercept and B is the slope. So B is really telling you this relationship between disposable income and desired consumption. So if disposable income goes up by $1, the slope is telling us how much of that dollar that we're going to spend, or we want to spend in terms of desired spend on consumption. And we're going to say we're going to kind of denote that as the marginal propensity to consume. Maybe I'll just put a line down here. MPC is going to be the marginal propensity to consume. So what that's saying is if your disposable income went up by $1, how much do you change your desired level of consumption? So it's the change, should be a delta, change in consumption from a change in YD, in disposable income. So MPC equals this change in consumption from a change in YD. And that's, essentially, I wanted a different color, I'm gonna just pull the same one out. That's exactly what B is telling us, right? That's what the slope is telling us. If our disposable income goes up by $1, we're gonna save some of that and spend some of that in consumption. The marginal propensity to consume is telling you how much of that dollar you're gonna spend on consumption expenditure. So it's the slope of our consumption function. So it needs to be less than 1. And we can also think on the other side of it, the the marginal propensity to save. And I'm going to write out save because there's going to be kind of 2 MPS in our model. And so I'm just going to kind of specify the marginal propensity to save. It's going to be less than 1, kind of assuming that you don't spend every dollar you make, every dollar increase in disposable income. If you spend that whole dollar on consumption expenditure, it would be exactly 1. If you spend none of it on consumption expenditure, it's going to be 0. We're going to kind of mostly assume that it's between 0 and 1. And so the marginal propensity to save is, if our disposable income goes up by $1, how much of that dollar are we going to save? And because we can only do 2 things, we can either save or consume this amount of money, then that marginal propensity to save plus the marginal propensity to consume adds up to $1. Okay, so changes in disposable income are going to change desired consumption by B. Now we need to kind of maybe expand on this a bit and talk about how these other factors, wealth and interest rates, are going to influence our consumption.